The dawn sky above the Nevada desert stretched endlessly, painted in shades of amber and rose. Captain Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his helmet one final time as he approached his F-22 Raptor, the sleek fighter jet gleaming under the hangar lights. At 34, Marcus had logged over 2,000 flight hours and earned a reputation as one of the most precise pilots in the 58th Fighter Squadron. His hands moved with practiced efficiency across the pre-flight checklist, muscle memory guiding every switch and dial. Red Leader, this is Control Tower. Weather is clear, winds at 5 knots from the northwest. You're cleared for takeoff in 10 minutes. The voice crackled through his headset as Marcus settled into the cockpit. Today's mission was routine and intercept training exercise with an unidentified aircraft that had entered restricted airspace. The radar signature suggested it was likely a small civilian plane that had wandered off course, probably a weekend pilot who'd gotten confused about the boundaries. Marcus taxied onto the runway alongside his wingman, Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a younger pilot with sharp eyes and steady nerves. They'd flown together for 6 months, developing the kind of trust that only comes from shared danger thousands of feet above the ground. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and both jets screamed into the morning sky, their engines carving white contrails against the blue canvas above. 20 minutes into the flight, Marcus spotted the target on his radar, a small aircraft flying erratically about 50 miles southeast of their position. Red 2, I have visual on the bogey. Appears to be a single-engine Cessna flying at 8,000 feet. His training kicked in as he began the standard intercept procedure. The protocol was clear. Approach the aircraft, attempt radio contact, and if the pilot didn't respond or comply with instructions to land, they were authorized to use force. As they closed distance, Marcus could see the small white plane clearly through his canopy. It was indeed a Cessna 172, the kind of aircraft used by flight schools and weekend enthusiasts across the country. The plane seemed to be flying in lazy circles, as if the pilot was lost or perhaps experiencing mechanical difficulties. Marcus tried multiple radio frequencies, calling out standard warnings and instructions for the pilot to respond. Unknown aircraft, this is United States Air Force. You are in restricted airspace. Please respond immediately and follow my instructions. Silence filled the radio waves. Marcus felt the familiar tension that came with these intercepts. Most civilian pilots, when confronted by military aircraft, complied quickly. The few who didn't usually had good reasons, radio failure, medical emergency, or simple panic. Red Leader, still no response from the target. Jake's voice came through the comm system. Should we proceed to the next phase? Marcus knew what that meant. If the aircraft continued to ignore their warnings and posed a potential threat, they were authorized to fire warning shots, and if necessary, neutralize the target entirely. The small plane continued its erratic flight pattern, seemingly oblivious to the two fighter jets now flanking it on either side. Marcus could see into the cockpit now. A single figure hunched over the controls, wearing a baseball cap and what appeared to be a leather jacket. Something about the pilot's posture suggested distress rather than defiance. Commander Thompson's voice crackled through the radio from ground control. "Red Leader, you are cleared to engage. The aircraft has been non-responsive for 12 minutes and continues to violate restricted airspace. Use your discretion, but neutralize the threat if necessary." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He'd never had to fire on a civilian aircraft before, though he'd trained for this scenario countless times. His finger moved to the weapons system, the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The radar lock engaged with a soft beep, and he could see the missile guidance system painting the small Cessna with invisible targeting lasers. "Red 2, I'm locked on target, preparing to fire warning shots." Marcus's training told him to follow protocol, but something nagged at him. The pilot's erratic flying pattern, the way the small plane seemed to struggle with basic maneuvers. It all suggested someone in genuine distress rather than a potential threat. Through his powerful optics, Marcus studied the aircraft more carefully. The Cessna was older, probably from the 1980s, with faded paint and what looked like some kind of marking on the fuselage. As he maneuvered closer, trying to get a better look, his heart nearly stopped. There, painted on the side of the aircraft in barely visible letters, was something that made his blood run cold. The marking was partially obscured by years of weather and wear, but Marcus could make out enough to recognize it. Anderson Flight Academy, established 1976. His hands began to shake as memories flooded back, memories he'd buried for 15 years. Anderson Flight Academy was where he'd learned to fly, where a gruff old instructor named Bill Anderson had first put him in the cockpit of a Cessna 172 exactly like this one. Marcus remembered those early lessons with crystal clarity, the smell of aviation fuel, the feel of the controls in his young hands, and most importantly, the patient voice of his instructor guiding him through each maneuver. Bill Anderson had been more than just a flight instructor. He'd been a mentor, a father figure to a kid from a broken home who'd found solace in the sky. "Red Leader, what's your status?" Jake's voice brought Marcus back to the present. The targeting system was still locked on, missiles ready to fire. But now Marcus was staring at what might be the same aircraft where he'd first learned to love flying, possibly piloted by the man who'd made his entire career possible. "Stand by, Red 2. Marcus's voice was barely steady. He needed to think, needed to find another way. The aircraft's erratic flight pattern suddenly made sense. If this was indeed Bill Anderson, the old instructor would be in his 70s now, possibly dealing with a medical emergency or mechanical failure. Marcus remembered the last time he'd seen Bill Anderson, at his graduation from flight school. The old man had shaken his hand with tears in his eyes, saying he'd never been prouder of any student. "You're going to do great things in the sky, son," he'd said. "Just remember where you came from." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Here he was, potentially about to shoot down the very man who'd taught him to fly, using skills that Bill Anderson had helped him develop. The thought made him sick to his stomach. Red Leader, ground control is requesting immediate action. The aircraft is approaching a populated area. Commander Thompson's voice was sharp with urgency. Marcus looked at his navigation display and saw that the small plane was indeed heading toward a small town about 10 miles away. Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his career. Instead of firing, he maneuvered his fighter jet directly in front of the Cessna, close enough that the pilot couldn't possibly miss seeing him. He waggled his wings in the universal aviation signal for "follow me" and began a slow turn toward the nearest airstrip. For a moment, nothing happened. The small plane continued its erratic flight. Then, slowly, it began to follow Marcus's lead. Relief flooded through him as he guided the aircraft toward a small regional airport about 15 miles away. Throughout the descent, Marcus kept trying different radio frequencies, hopping to establish contact. Finally, as they approached the airport, a weak, crackling voice came through the radio. "Air Force Jet, this is Bill Anderson. I'm having engine trouble and my radio's been acting up. Thank you for guiding me down." The voice was older, frailer than Marcus remembered, but unmistakably the same man who'd taught him to fly. Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes as he watched the small Cessna touch down safely on the runway. Emergency vehicles were already positioned nearby, and Marcus could see ground crews rushing to assist the elderly pilot. He circled overhead, watching as Bill Anderson climbed out of the aircraft under his own power, waving up at the fighter jets that had escorted him to safety. "Red Leader, excellent work. Target is secure and no longer a threat." Commander Thompson's voice carried a note of approval. "Return to base for debriefing." As Marcus climbed back to cruising altitude, he couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. He'd come within seconds of firing on the man who'd changed his life, who'd given him the gift of flight. The thought of what might have happened if he'd followed protocol without question haunted him. Back at the base, Marcus found himself in the unusual position of requesting permission to visit the civilian pilot who'd been brought in for questioning. Commander Thompson raised an eyebrow but agreed, curious about Marcus's interest in what should have been a routine intercept. Marcus found Bill Anderson in the base medical facility, being checked over by a flight surgeon. The old man looked up as Marcus entered, still wearing his flight suit but with his helmet tucked under his arm. For a moment, Neither man spoke. "Well, I'll be damned," Bill Anderson said finally, his weathered face breaking into a slow smile. "Marcus Rodriguez. I'd recognize those eyes anywhere, even behind all that fancy military gear." He stood up slowly, extending a hand that Marcus grasped firmly. "Mr. Anderson, I almost—" Marcus struggled to find the words. "How do you tell someone you nearly killed them?" "I know, son, I know." Bill's voice was gentle, understanding. "You were doing your job. I should have checked my radio equipment before I took off. Old habits, I guess. Sometimes we old pilots get a little too comfortable with our routines." Marcus learned that Bill Anderson, now 73, had been flying to visit his granddaughter when his radio malfunctioned, and he'd become disoriented in an area he didn't know well. The engine trouble had been minor, but enough to affect his flying. He'd been trying to find a place to land when the fighter jets had appeared. "I have to ask," Marcus said, "what made you decide to follow me instead of continuing on your original course?" Bill smiled, the same expression Marcus remembered from their early flying lessons. "Son, when a man spent 50 years teaching young pilots, he learns to recognize good instincts. You could have fired on me. I know the procedures. I know what you're authorized to do. But you chose to guide me home instead. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of pilot you've become." Over the next hour, Marcus and Bill caught up on 15 years of life. Marcus learned that the old flight school had closed down 5 years ago, a victim of changing regulations and economic pressures. Bill had kept his old Cessna, the same one Marcus had learned in, and used it to visit family scattered across the country. "You know," Bill said as they prepared to part ways, "I always wondered what happened to that scared kid from the broken home who showed up at my airfield with big dreams and empty pockets. I'm glad to see he turned out all right." Marcus realized that this encounter had changed something fundamental in his approach to flying. He'd always been technically proficient, but now he understood the deeper responsibility that came with his position. Sometimes the most important decisions weren't about following protocol. They were about recognizing the humanity in every situation. The incident report Marcus filed that evening was straightforward. Successful intercept of civilian aircraft experiencing mechanical difficulties. Pilot safely escorted to landing. He didn't mention the personal connection, didn't elaborate on the moment of recognition that had changed everything. But privately, Marcus knew this day would define the rest of his career. He'd learned that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't pulling the trigger. It's choosing not to, trusting your instincts over your orders, and remembering that behind every aircraft designation is a human being with their own story. Bill Anderson returned to his family the next day, his Cessna repaired, and his faith in the next generation of pilots renewed. Marcus returned to his regular flight schedule, but with a new perspective on what it meant to serve and protect. 6 months later, Marcus received a letter from Bill Anderson. Inside was a photograph of Marcus as a young flight student, standing next to the same Cessna 172 they'd encountered in the sky. On the back, in Bill's careful handwriting, were the words, "To Marcus, you were always meant to fly. Thank you for remembering where you came from." Marcus kept that photograph in his flight bag, a reminder of the day he'd almost fired on his own history and the choice that had defined him as both a pilot and a man. It served as a constant reminder that every decision in the cockpit carried the weight of human lives, and that sometimes the most important skill a pilot could possess wasn't technical expertise. It was the wisdom to know when to trust his heart over his orders. The story of that day became part of squadron legend, though most pilots never knew the full details. It was told as an example of good judgment under pressure, of the importance of exhausting all options before using lethal force. For Marcus, it remained a deeply personal reminder of the connections that bind us all together, even thousands of feet above the ground. Years later, when Marcus became an instructor himself, he would tell his students about the importance of looking beyond the target designation, of remembering that every aircraft carried someone's son or daughter, someone's hopes and dreams. He never told them about Bill Anderson specifically, but the lesson was clear. In the sky, as in life, the most important decisions are often the ones that preserve life rather than take it. The encounter had taught Marcus that true strength sometimes meant showing restraint, that the greatest victories weren't always won through firepower, but through wisdom, compassion, and the courage to choose a different path. It was a lesson that would guide him through the rest of his military career and beyond, a reminder that the best pilots were those who remembered their humanity even at 30,000 feet. In the end, Marcus Rodriguez had learned that sometimes the most important thing a fighter pilot could do wasn't to engage the enemy. It was to recognize when there was no enemy at all, just another human being in need of help. And in that recognition, he had found not just his purpose as a pilot, but his identity as a man who would always choose to guide others home rather than shoot them down. The incident remained classified in official records, but for Marcus, it became the defining moment of his career. He had faced the ultimate test of his training and judgment, and had chosen compassion over protocol, humanity over procedure. It was a choice he would never regret, and one that would influence every decision he made in the cockpit for the rest of his flying career. As he continued to serve his country in the years that followed, Marcus carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the greatest act of service wasn't following orders blindly, but having the courage to question them when human lives hung in the balance. It was a lesson taught not in any flight manual, but in a moment of recognition 30,000 feet above the Nevada desert, when a fighter pilot chose to save rather than destroy, and in doing so, saved a piece of his own soul as well.